Right. The subject of this panel is how do we learn from the past? It is the common qualification that you see in the three panelists is that they have studied war or they have experienced war in the immediate past. Four panelists, I beg their pardon, can't count. Three, most military theory works in threes, you see, so that's why going to four is difficult. What we are also have is a blend of service and academic background. Moving from my left and your right, you have Professor Andrew Preston, who is here at Churchill, an American historian and in particular an expert on recent American security policy. Immediately to my right and your left, Gill Bennett, former Foreign Office historian, has written on intelligence, on recent diplomatic crises, and further back in time, of course, interwar matters. Moving across, two graduates, I'm delighted to say, the University of Oxford. One former Chief of General Staff of the Army with extensive experience in the 1990s, and also, of course, the military advisor to the Chilcot Inquiry. That is General Sir Roger Wheeler. And at the end of the row, Admiral Chris Parry, both experienced in terms of his operational deployments in the Falklands, and also in his last post at the Joint Doctrine and Concept Centre, as it was still called in those days, Chris. I think I'm right to say, because it changed to DCDC by that time. It had. He's telling me off. So each of them has 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes in the rules of engagement. I shall simply go in the order in which they're on my sheet of paper, which means, Gill, that you get the first go.
I get the first go. Right. Okay, thank you, Hugh. Okay, well, how do we learn from the past? Just a small subject for 10 minutes. But that, of course, implies that we do learn. And if you are a historian, particularly a historian who works in government, as I do, you find yourself addressing a lot of audiences who insist that we never do learn from the past. But I argue that we can and that we do, but that there are positive and negative outcomes from studying wars in the past. And I'm just going to talk about a very few of these in relation to wars both hot and cold, really since 1945, although the learning process and the type of lessons that come from war can be identified in many other periods, and certainly, of course, after the First World War. And I'm going to address in particular how governments and policymakers might learn from the past, and specifically in relation to intelligence, which is my own particular professional area of focus. Now, of course, there is a general caveat. I am a historian. I know that no circumstance or crisis is exactly the same, and it's never possible to apply exactly the lessons of the past to another episode. I can quote from the Chilcot report, I'm sure you won't mind, which said about the invasion of Iraq, it was the product of a particular set of circumstances which are unlikely to be repeated. And that really applies to almost everything. But knowledge and understanding of what went before are a key component of dealing sensibly and effectively with the problems and crises that present themselves now. I've got three what I would call learning outcomes, except I don't really like that phrase, but you know what I mean, which have both positive and negative sides to them. The first is a simple one. Direct experience of war, of conflict, can be a very valuable asset to politicians, not just in making them determined not to do it again, but in their whole life experience, and particularly in periods immediately after a war, increased empathy with the population that they represent. If you think, for example, of Clement Attlee, who had served in the First World War, and that certainly made a difference to him, not just during the Second World War, but in his administration from 45 to 51. It gave him also an understanding of balance and context. I'll just give you two very quick examples here. One is the question of Berlin, when the Berlin crisis erupted in June 1948, when the Soviets cut off the access to the western zones of Berlin, the then CIGS, Field Marshal Montgomery, went to see Attlee and demanded that they should immediately mobilize, they should be ready for war. And Attlee said, look, I've got an awful lot on my plate at the moment, all over the world, including there's a rice food crisis in India, there's this, there's that, all over the world. This is just one of the problems we face, and we can't rush into anything. That may be a very Attlee-ish remark, but it's also a very wise remark, and it was certainly informed by his experience of war. Also, and this is an example I'm quoting from Peter Hennessy's wonderful book, The Secret State, he quotes Attlee talking about civil defence in 1948 again. He said, the government are not prepared to devote resources to passive defence at the expense of weakening our striking force or impeding our economic recovery. And that's another example of balancing up the various factors. Of course, the Attlee government, and indeed following that, the Conservative governments and Harold Wilson's Labour governments all had people in them, members of the government, who had served in the military. And that does affect how people look at things. But the experience does not only extend to those who served in the military, it can also be civil experience during wartime. For example, in the Attlee government, Stafford Cripps and Bevin, their roles during the conflict, and indeed there were Harold Wilson, for example, his Board of Trade experience that he brought later on. In the intelligence sphere, direct experience is of course also an asset in terms of continuity, particularly in certain technical spheres, like signals intelligence, SIGINT, for example. But I think we'll move on for that for the moment. Now, the negative side of having direct experience of conflict, I would suggest there are several. It can certainly lead to what I would call false analogies. In the 1940s and 50s in particular, policymakers, when there was a crisis, tended to look back to the interwar period and say, this is like that, when it wasn't. Suez is a classic example of that. Macmillan called Colonel Nasser an Asiatic Mussolini. Anthony Eden looked back and talked about Hitler. Now, they didn't really think it was exactly the same, but their use of those analogies was actually it constrained the way they looked at things, and they weren't the only two either. And I think if you're moving much further forward now, you get people talking about another Cold War. I think this is profoundly unhistorical, because whatever is happening now, and however much conflict there is, and General Sir Nick gave us a very good insight into it, it is not a Cold War in any sense equivalent, in my view, with the Cold War that we experienced between the late 40s and 1990. Experience of victory or defeat in war can also lead to false assumptions. For example, in the Korean War, American policymakers didn't think the Chinese would dare to take on the Americans. They thought the Chinese were going to attack Taiwan. And they had the wrong kind of analogies that they were bringing forward. They were reluctant to change their minds, and the intelligence community in the United States was reluctant to challenge the military thinking. Also, there can be a rather false nostalgia for what are seen to be successful operations in more modern times. You hear people, General Sir Nick mentioned it, talk about Sierra Leone or Kosovo, these or incomplete ones. Certain American strategists considering that the first Gulf War was incomplete because Saddam Hussein remained in place, and we know what happened after that. And again, those who are serving, who have previous military experience, can, particularly in the realm of covert operations, I'm thinking now of people who served in the Second World War in the Special Operations Executive, for example, they tended to have a totally unrealistic expectation of what they could do in a post-war situation. Think what we did then, we can do again, and that did not work well. And I think this is the last difficulty I'd mention here. We are now living in a situation where a vast majority of people, including people in this room, don't remember the Cold War, never mind remembering hot wars. That does create difference of perceptions, and it means that history is even more important. And here I was very pleased to hear General Sir Nick talking about looking at things from the point of view of Russia, because experience of war, of serving in war, applies to your opponents just as much as it applies to you, and it's very important to try and think how things look from the other side. Okay, my second outcome. However bad the experience of conflict may have been, the results of war, i.e. neutralising a negative or repressive system, breaking the mould, in fact, can actually be a good thing. It may not seem like it at the time, but it can be good to challenge conventional concepts of spheres of influence, military competition, use of global resources, for example, and the determination not to repeat previous conflicts can provide opportunities for collaborative working, formation of multinational organisations like the UN, for example. The Marshall Plan would never have happened without the Second World War, after all. This is kind of what you might call the peace dividend. And in the intelligence world, it can produce new opportunities for new ways of looking at things, whether it's technical cooperation, as, for example, the very close Anglo-American security intelligence relationship, which was formed in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, or broader things. Like, some of you may have come across a wonderful book by a former CIA analyst called Cynthia Grabo called Anticipating Surprise, and she explains that analysis for strategic warfare strategic warning was a new concept that arose out of the Second World War and future conflicts, and it became a definable intelligence product. This came out of conflict. Organisational reform, particularly in the sphere of intelligence, comes out of conflict and can play a very important part in reshaping the communities all over the world. In this country, the Bland report on the Secret Intelligence Service at the end of the Second World War, far more recently, the Michael Quinlan Review in 1994, setting out reasons why it was important to maintain a covert capability, the kind of lessons we can learn from the Butler report, for example, which is an extraordinarily valuable document on intelligence, which really has never been properly exploited yet. And of course, Chilcot we're still looking at. Now, the negative side of all this brave new post-World War world, whether it's at a political or an intelligence level, can seem too straightforward. People assume they know what's going to happen. They know how it's going to work out. And that kind of mindset is ill-adapted to surprise. I have to move on quickly since Hugh's showed me in it. The third one, war is a powerful catalyst for technological development, of course, in the military and in particular in intelligence. UK nuclear capability owes its origins to the Second World War. Other positive developments in all kinds of intelligence technology, and also civil developments of that, satellite communications and so on. This is very important, and it has a positive outcome. So, on a less technological level, I would also point to language training. This may seem a rather esoteric thing, but the Second World War produced an explosion and the beginning of the Cold War in learning Russian, realising that you needed people to learn Russian. Rather like after 9/11, there was an explosion of people learning Arabic. The negative side of this technological development can be a tendency to produce an arms race and to substitute military rivalry for cooperation, and the assumption that technical innovation and military might are a sufficient as well as a necessary protection. So I'll just finish up, Bradley. We can best learn from the past by keeping good records. As a historian, you will expect me to say that, and in this, with the archives here, I cannot stress how important that is and how much it is under threat. And allowing analysts and historians the thinking space to use those records and bring key points to decision makers' notice when possible, which is what my role as an official historian has always been to be. And finally, remember that there is a continuum. There is very little that is new. George Bush did not invent the war on terror. It was a phrase used by President Theodore Roosevelt when his predecessor, President McKinley, was assassinated in 1901. Thank you.
Jill, thank you very much indeed. Just to be clear, we're going to go straight through with our presenters, and then there'll be a chance for discussion. And I realise that Jill is first on the list because B becomes before W for Wheeler. So actually what we're going to do now is proceed chronologically, if the gentleman on my right and your left will forgive that, because I'm going to ask Andrew Preston.
I was all geared up.
Well, there we are, Chris. You're going to be last now for interfering. Andrew Preston is thinking about Vietnam, and it's over to him that I should turn next.
Okay, thanks, Hugh, and thanks for the no warning for the ambush, but that's fine. And what I'd like to do in my 10 minutes is just talk very briefly and very generally about the American way of war. If there is an American way of war, as we've known it for the last 30 or 40 years, it's warfare that heavily relies on technology, incredibly sophisticated technology. It's war from the air, it's war from the sea, so offshore and aerial forms of warfare, which guarantee a low or very small footprint on the ground. And I just want to ask some questions that historians are only beginning really now to ask about how we got there. There are lots of theories as to how we got to this American way of war. But surprisingly, not very much of that discussion brings Vietnam into the consideration. And I'd like to do so in my remarks today. And to maybe offer a few suggestive thoughts about what that tells us about our world, the world in which we live today. So how did we get here? How did we get to this American way of warfare? And what I'd like to submit to you today is that Vietnam was absolutely transformational in how the United States has waged its wars. It was transformational in many ways, but especially in military and strategic terms, but not necessarily always for military and strategic reasons, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Lyndon Johnson once described the Vietnam War, as a different kind of war. And that's true to a certain extent, but I also want to push LBJ on that very point. And I want to push LBJ, which is a little unfair considering that he's been dead now for 43 years, but I want to push him because I'm also pushing a generation of historians who have accepted that characterization of Vietnam as a different kind of war and have kind of taken it for granted. And I'd like to just push back on that a little bit by focusing on a couple of aspects in particular. And the general argument that I'd like to make is that Vietnam caused what we might call a crisis of legitimacy. A crisis of legitimacy in the United States as well as around the world. That what was once acceptable in any number of facets of society, what was once acceptable, the old way of doing things, that had been the way of doing things for a long period of time, was now unacceptable, was no longer acceptable. And that's true domestically in the United States in the 1960s as well as a number of other countries. The old ways of doing, say, race relations or gender relations, at some point in the 1960s became untenable. They became illegitimate. And that's certainly true for warfare. The old ways of waging war were no longer acceptable. So when Lyndon Johnson approached Vietnam in the 1960s after July 28, 1965, when he Americanized the war, that is, he took the war over from the South Vietnamese, and William Westmoreland, his main commander in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, when they confronted the problem of Vietnam, they applied very old ways of thinking to the Vietnam War. There's some evidence that LBJ was thinking about applying modernization theory and some new aspects of counterinsurgency to the war. That came fairly late in 1967 when he was desperate and looking for things to go well. But from the outset, Westmoreland and Johnson and Robert McNamara, when they looked at Vietnam, saw the conflict in Vietnam in very traditional terms. And so a lot of the things that they used in Vietnam that were so controversial in the 1960s were actually borrowing from quite traditional and quite conventional ways, American ways of waging war. So napalm, for instance, was invented in World War II. Napalm, of course, is an anti-personnel weapon. It's designed to hurt people. It's designed to maim people, to weaken the enemy that way. And it was invented in World War II. It was used quite often in World War II, and it was used very frequently in Korea. It was then used in World War II in Korea really without any comment in public opinion, in Congress. It was just another weapon that people used. But it became incredibly controversial during the Vietnam War. And it became a kind of moral crisis for military strategy during Vietnam. The bombing of civilians happened, of course, on a mass scale in World War II. It happened on a mass scale in Korea as well, again, with some protest during World War II, not really much protest at all during Korea, and I'm speaking in the United States domestically. But during the Vietnam era, it became a real litmus test for your views on the morality of warfare, and especially on the morality of what the United States was doing in Vietnam. It was the saturation bombing, Operation Rolling Thunder, but also ArcLight and a number of other campaigns in South Vietnam that brought people like Martin Luther King into the anti-war movement, and they were very explicit about that. The war of attrition, which was the basis of Westmoreland's strategy in Vietnam, of course, was not new to Vietnam. So a lot of the things that LBJ thought or characterized as different about Vietnam, as new ways of warfare, a lot of the things that attracted a great deal of controversy during the 1960s and that were considered beyond the pale were actually time-honored and time-tested ways of the United States waging war. And what happened was the moral ground in the 1960s shifted under Johnson and Westmoreland's feet. They turned to Vietnam, they saw an American war that needed some kind of strategy and needed some kind of solution, and surprise, surprise, they turned, especially Westmoreland, with what they knew best. Now, it turned out to be a catastrophic strategic decision because Westmoreland's strategy was designed to win the war, but actually if he was coming up with a way to lose the war in the fastest possible way, he would have come up with the strategy that he did based on search and destroy, a war of attrition, and the search for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese armies breaking point. But it wasn't illogical. It was a perfectly logical thing for him to do, and it was logical for Johnson to approve of Westmoreland's strategy. But the moral ground shifted under their feet. And this not only created strategic and military difficulties in the field in South Vietnam, but it also created tremendous domestic unrest, domestic opposition and dissent. And indeed, it created not just a domestic anti-war movement of unprecedented size and ferocity and voice and impact, it also created an international anti-war movement. And so coming out of Vietnam, waging war the usual way was no longer tenable. And this is what I mean by a crisis of legitimacy. There was a crisis in what was legitimate and what was now considered illegitimate. And yet, for American war planners, war wasn't going to go away, much as I think a lot of people in the U.S. military wanted it to go away after Vietnam, because Vietnam was such a difficult war for the American military, especially for the Army and the Marine Corps. Wars weren't going to go away. The United States was still going to have to, the American war planners still expected to fight war, including foreign wars, including very difficult foreign wars. And so this stimulated thinking about the need to wage war more narrowly, more quietly, without necessarily American troops, and also to minimize casualties on the ground in places where the United States would be fighting wars. And this is what I would call the irony of protest from Vietnam, that this large anti-war movement that really pushed this notion of a crisis of legitimacy quite hard and much further than anybody else was, didn't delegitimize warfare itself. What it did was it made American war planners try and find ways in which to wage war more quietly and more cleanly, and so on and so forth. And so the anti-war movement, against everything that it would have intended, actually made necessary something like the revolution in military affairs. Now, I want to be careful, especially for the military historians here. I'm not saying that the anti-war movement in the United States was the sole reason for the RMA that emerged in the 1980s and 90s, this very highly technological way of waging war. But I would say it's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's one that historians so far have missed. And it was this cleaner way of waging war that really characterized American intervention, foreign intervention, up until Iraq and Afghanistan. And indeed, you could make the case that it still characterizes the American way of warfare now. And what's interesting, I've really been trying to grapple, and I'll say this in closing, I've been trying to grapple with Syria and what Syria means for American military history, thinking as an historian, and what Syria will mean looking back 20 years from now, 50 years from now, and that sort of thing, as well as what it means for us today. And that's that Syria is changing the American way of war, or rather it's posing challenges, unique challenges to the American way of war that the United States hasn't had to confront so far. And this is because of the intervention of Russia in Syria, as well as ISIS on the ground. In other words, the intervention and the participation of groups, of nation states who don't necessarily embrace the need for a cleaner way of war or for a quieter way of war. And this is something that American technology can't really adequately deal with. The American way of war was unopposed by another great power or a very strong presence like ISIS on the ground in both Iraq wars, in Bosnia, in Serbia, and in Afghanistan. I'm not saying, of course, that the United States was unopposed, but it was unopposed by a force like Russia, a great power like Russia with tremendous military potential that doesn't mind waging war in a really dirty, old-fashioned way. And this is one reason why Syria, I think, is such an important watershed where even the shadow even of Vietnam doesn't reach. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. We've connected past to present very neatly there. General Sir Roger Wheeler, over to you.
Thank you. I would start by saying that I recognise that the British Army is often accused of fighting the last war. But whilst it's easy to be wise after the event, there is value in studying the past, and I'm going to talk about one occasion when we forgot the lessons of the past, to talk briefly about preparation and training for war, and lastly, motivation and what the Army sometimes calls the moral component of fighting power. Over my 40 years in the Army, there were a variety of campaigns, as I've implied, when initially we failed to heed the lessons of the past, and I choose Northern Ireland in the 1970s. I was then a young officer, and we were being taught the nature and importance of the Malayan counterinsurgency campaign in the 1950s, which was regarded as a great success under another Irish Field Marshal Templar, that is to say, another one after Montgomery. He directed the security forces to operate within the context of political, social, and economic development. He established joint civil, military, intelligence, and police committees at all levels to plan the campaign and the operations of the day. And yet, it took a few years for us, the military and the government, to apply that in Northern Ireland. By the time I arrived there in 1993 as the Director of Military Operations, I should emphasize in support of the civil power, we had the legislation that we needed in the form of the Emergency Powers Act and the Prevention of Terrorism Act, within which the security forces could operate, giving us, for example, powers of arrest, rules of engagement, and that sort of thing. We had co-terminal police and military boundaries from brigade down to company level. The coordinated campaign was directed by the Secretary of State, in my day, Lord Mayhew, at the security policy meeting, with economic, social, and political development within the province at the heart of the campaign. At the operational level, in 1992, the Province Executive Committee was produced with a two-star soldier and his opposite number as the ACC Ops, directing operations from the security point of view within that overall context that I've already mentioned. And the ACC Ops at the time, one Blair Wallace, was heard to observe that at long last we now have an organisation that is personality-proof. You might wonder why I say that, but the friction between the military and the police over the previous 20 years had been unhelpful, to say the least, on some occasions. And he thought that by learning and remembering the lessons of Malaya and producing this interlocked organisation, we at long last had got it right. Units that were committed to the campaign had tailored training packages of several months' duration and exercises with both the RUC and the civil government in the area to which they were going to deploy. And I believe that helped us to arrive at a solution. It wasn't a military solution, but the security forces played a very important part within the overall government policy. Basically, what happened was that the social and economic policy removed the very reasonable grievances that the Catholic population had had ever since the border was formed. To some extent, we did remember the need for close civil-military cooperation in the stabilization operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. But unfortunately, from my experience on the Chilcot inquiry, we did not achieve that close cooperation in Iraq in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. The late Hilary Sinnott, who was the British Commissioner in 2003-04, expressed regret in his evidence to the inquiry that his headquarters was separated from that of the British commander in the south, Graham Lamb, by some 13 miles. And this reflected the lack of joined-up planning and government direction in Whitehall, as the Chilcot inquiry made plain in its report. Nor, incidentally, did we supply the military force levels capable of providing effective security within which civil government could carry out the reconstruction of infrastructure, electricity, power, and water, which led initially to frustration and eventually to insurgency from the local Shia population, who initially had been supportive. What of the most demanding threat which our military forces may face, as General Nick implied? We used to call it high-intensity conflict in the Army, rather than the asymmetric warfare of the last 13 years or so. Some people said in the early 1990s that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we would not face that sort of warfare again, and apart from the actual invasion of Iraq, nor have we. But now, as has already been mentioned several times, there is Russia's growing capability and activity in Crimea and Ukraine, as well as the threat to the Baltic states. The development, as I saw in the Times the other day, of a T-14 tank which outmatches anything that NATO forces can produce, recently on display in Red Square, would seem to underline Putin's intent at least to build up his forces and therefore to be able to threaten. Last week, the BBC told me about new cruise missiles in Syria. This morning's Times tells us about missiles in Kaliningrad. For land operations, we need not only to learn the lessons from the past, but to train for what I call all-arms maneuver warfare, including, of course, air support. In the 1980s, many people were critical of the enormous exercises that used to happen in the British Army of the Rhine. Many of us spent an awful lot of time sitting about, not doing very much. But it did practice the staffs in brigade and divisional headquarters in the friction of war, moving and committing formations to action. And in the late 90s, I went to visit a brigade exercise in Poland, a British brigade, where I met 3 NCOs, one of whom was in the Royal Artillery, and he said, "You know, boss, we've only just done this in time. We've had 7 years since we last practiced this. Nobody in those battle groups remembers that until my fire plan goes down, they can't move." The Royal Engineer Corporal said, "And nor do they remember that until I've taken up the obstacle or laid down the obstacle, they're stuck." And then a light dragoon, a reconnaissance corporal, said, "And what's more, sir, we have forgotten how to lift off the wagons because we've been living in houses in Bosnia and we just don't know how to live in the field." And that was a gap of 7 years, in their opinion, since we'd last practiced that which we would need if we went into high-intensity conflict. It is at least arguable that the Russians will foment trouble within countries like Lithuania rather than mount conventional forces initially. But the capability is there, and NATO needs to provide a credible deterrent as far forward as we can, bearing in mind what General Nick said about not upsetting the apple cart to too great an extent. In the British Army, we're very lucky. We have a very large training area the size of Dorset in Canada in which we can practice that form of warfare with live ammunition. It's proved invaluable in the past, and it's something we need to hang on to. I conclude with a few words on the moral component of fighting power. Not so much learning from the past as acknowledging a key aspect of how we fight within the law of armed conflict and the Geneva Convention, but also the development of the character as well as the skills of our men and women. One of the challenges I had as Chief of the General Staff in the late 1990s, dealing with ministers who had no military experience, was to get them to understand that in some important respects, the military are different from the society from whom we draw our recruits. Firstly, the needs of the team over the rights of the individual if we are to maintain operational effectiveness, whereas, quite properly, the rights of the individual are preeminent in our society at large. Secondly, the effects of European law and the inappropriate nature of aspects such as the Working Time Directive, not just when campaigning but in garrison too, as well as the need to be sensible about the laws for the employment of people under 18. 80% of the warrant officers in the British Army were junior soldiers. Lastly, how to incorporate equality, be it the roles of women or racial diversity, to which we found an interesting solution. We formed a special ethnic minority recruiting team. You might argue a pejorative term in its own case, but that was because people like Dame Kelly Holmes and Chris Akabusi, whom I consulted, said it's no use you going into these communities to recruit. You need brown faces and black faces, and you need to get them to do it themselves. Those 12 people raised the percentage of ethnic minorities within the British Army from 1% to 5% in 3 years. And at long last, we had a situation in which somebody from racial minorities was no longer unusual. And they were able to settle down and be soldiers. Not only do we have to explain to government and society at large why, if they want us to be effective operationally, we cannot adopt all the mores of today's society, we also have to explain it to those who join us, so that they understand what is expected of them. To explain that the more libertarian values of modern Britain, with its emphasis, as I have said, on the rights of the individual, are sometimes at odds with the obligation for collective identity and purpose. And that is why the values and standards we expected of everybody was codified in April 2000 with the issue of a pamphlet, which I gather is still extant today. And that emphasized the need for selfless commitment, courage, discipline, particularly self-discipline, integrity, loyalty, and respect for others. But it is a two-way street, and we in the Army have an obligation to our people too, to support and back them in their operational decisions, to use their initiative and to display flexibility in their decision-making. We call it mission command, so that the team, at whatever level, achieves that vital cohesiveness in battle if we are to fight and win.
Thank you very much indeed. If you like a connection between past and present, I said just now that Chris Parry, as well as being a sailor, had run the Joint Doctrine and Concept Centre, which was indeed the wrong title, because under his rule it changed to the Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre. One of its functions was precisely to link present to future. Chris, I've given you, therefore, an open-ended brief, I think.
Well, I'm going to show off, because in 2006 we produced a document called Global Strategic Trends. You can see it on the internet. And the top 4 threats for the next 10 years, based on historical principles, were, first, uncontrolled migration from North Africa and the Middle East. Second, a re-emerging Russia. Third, an assertive China. And what was going to happen to 20,000 unemployed Muslim men whose only trade was fighting. 2006, ladies and gentlemen, it's 2016 now. That document was issued by the Ministry of Defence on historical principles as a means of transmitting to the future. And I'm going to take as my theme is that you need to be very pessimistic about the art of war and history. Why? I'm going to divide it into 2 things. One is the actual practice of history itself, and secondly is the lessons process. Now, I hope I'll never ever hear from you again 2 phrases. One is lessons learned, because they are only lessons. They're only learned when they're incorporated into doctrine, and I'll come on to how they need to be taken forward again. And secondly is this ridiculous term, nation-state. There are nations in the world, and there are states. And there are nations who live in lots of states. Look at all the diasporas we have today. And we need to get used to that construct in the modern world if we are to understand conflict and the multinational and multilateral way in which it's taking place. Nation state, please consign it to whatever dictionary you used 10 years ago, because it doesn't exist today. Okay, history. I'm going to say there's a pitifully low level of historical knowledge amongst military officers. We don't invest in it, people aren't trained in it. Most naval officers couldn't name you a ship at Trafalgar other than Victory or Redoutable. They'd be pushed to have Temeraire and maybe Royal Sovereign. But there are 50 other ships at Trafalgar, they don't know. Most army officers, present company accepted, barely know beyond their own regimental histories. And the context in which historical events and issues of great pitch and moment take place are barely mentioned. The people who write speeches for senior officers festoon them with historical analogies, rather like medieval chroniclers used to put biblical quotations in. But the context is totally lost, and please don't question the senior officers on the relevance of that historical reference, because you won't get a decent answer. Now, my own worry about the historical process started when I started reading about the Falklands War in secondary sources. And what I used to do is I used to go to books and read the bits I was involved in. And if it was reasonably accurate, I used to read the rest of the book. And I have to tell you that 95% of the books that I picked up, I put straight down again. And there's a serious problem, and I'm just doing a PhD myself, in the separation from the events and people of the time and the way it's reported later. And some of the things that Gill mentioned introduce serious distortion in these things. Sir Ian Hamilton, the chap who did a good job with withdrawing from Gallipoli, said, on the actual day of battle, naked truths may be had for the asking. By the following morning, they've already started to put on their uniforms. And again, Liddell Hart said here in Cambridge, the memories of participants in dramatic events are apt to become coloured and twisted in retrospect, and increasingly as the years pass. Moreover, official documents often fail to reveal their real views and aims, while even drafted to conceal them. And I have to tell you, I'm doing some research on Admiral King, the Chief of Naval Operations in the Second World War of the US Navy. And he was confronted by a historian who said, you haven't approved the Army version of Guadalcanal. And he said, well, yes, General Marshall and I agree that you used far too many low-level documents. And he said, well, of course, we're using the evidence. He said, we didn't even read those before the conference. So how can you actually base your judgments about our decisions on that? So we've got a serious problem, both within the services and also in the way in which history is addressed, because we actually build up mythologies around some of the campaigns that we've seen in the past. And unless we use direct evidence and context in relation to these things, we're going to end up with distorted lessons. Memoirs are even worse, because memoirs normally by generals and admirals, if they're not ghost-written, normally reflect what campaign they'd like to have fought or should have fought. And as Churchill himself said, and I wanted to get a Churchill quotation in, nobody's going to write a report or a memoir that's going to get people court-martialed. So don't look for objectivity. You have to have a very critical approach to all sources that don't actually appear contemporaneously. Now, lessons, shock horror. Okay, lessons are never learned unless they're incorporated into the way somebody fights. But as General Roger actually pointed out, there's this accent on perfecting the last day of the previous war rather than actually preparing for the first day of the next one. And you look at successive American campaigns, the first Gulf War was fought, the first day of the second Gulf War was a perfection of the first Gulf War. And so it goes on. Now, unless you translate lessons into doctrine and then therefore put investment and thinking into concepts about the future, you will not actually learn anything from your historical experience at all. I had the experience in the Falklands of getting lots of lessons, so did my shipmates. But as the latitude increased northwards, suddenly those lessons became politically and economically unacceptable. So they weren't lessons, they were left down in the South Atlantic. And I'll give you another example from the 1990s. We realized in the 1990s that having sonar devices at sea that only detected submarines 3.5 miles away but could be detected by submarines 120 miles away, was bad news, because it meant that people like Trevor in his submarine, rather like Roger sitting around doing nothing in Germany, could actually spend 100 miles watching a film before they actually got to us. So we discovered that actually if we switched off our sonars, the submarines couldn't find us. Funny old thing that, and where do we get those lessons from? All the convoy captains that we got together, the surviving ones who said, you know what, you had to wait for the submarine to come to you, see if he could find you. So you can actually glean lessons from the past if you go back to the original lessons. And we were very successful in saying, the real lesson out of this is you shouldn't put a surface ship in the same hemisphere as a nuclear submarine. Leave it to the aircraft and the other submarines. But, of course, here you run into another problem with lessons, vested interests. The older generation, the flag officers said, oh, no, 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 we've trained a whole generation in doing it the old way. It'll look like a very bad return on investment if we don't continue doing it. So if you're not going to do it in wartime, why are you doing it in practice? And my final point I think I need to make is we made an attempt a while ago to introduce a fourth component in fighting power. General Roger introduced the moral component. There's also the conceptual and the physical component. What we wanted to do is say we need to introduce the contextual component of fighting power, on the basis that British Army on the Rhine is not the same as British Army on the Helmand. And our contextual weakness in historical terms, and also in the way we operated, I'm afraid wasn't actually cutting it. That went all the way through the Ministry of Defence and was vetoed by one deranged four-star general, I regret to say, on his own personal whim. So, that's the problem. So even if you are a historian and you are trying to get your way in the art of war, don't expect to be listened to unless you have a very large megaphone or a lot of patronage. Where is it useful? History is useful for general principles. It validates the principles of warfare, not the principles of war. It dispels mythologies. It helps you with contextual understanding. It is fantastic with geopolitical theory and why Russia and China might be a problem 10 years after you first think it is. It's great in terms of comparison with various other historical events. I think its greatest value is dealing with the human aspects in terms of leadership and decision-making, but above all, what it says on the pediment of the United States National Archives, the past is prologue. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. We have 25 minutes for question and discussion, and that is precisely why each of our speakers has been very well disciplined. So we have that time, and we've got 3 questions there. So let's take the mic in that direction, and we'll have time for everybody. So let's just start at the bottom and work upwards. So the chap immediately on the edge of the, right? Yes, right. Yep, his hand up, and then we'll go to the gentleman to your.
Okay, so my name is Matteo Mirolo and I'm a student in this university. I was under the impression that both Generals Houghton and Wheeler, as well as Professor Preston, were speaking on how we are not adapting the RMA and other military strategies, the West of the current military strategies, are not adapting to new challenges, both in terms of non-conventional warfare, full-blown war, and other new challenges that we are facing at the moment. Now, I study politics, so there's a question that is obsessing me a bit at the moment, which is it always the politicians' fault? Are they always going to be stubborn about thinking they can do it better than the soldiers and having their idealist ideas about how to fight war? And especially, my question goes to the military people in this panel. Are there any ways to make politicians understand better how to wage war in the future? Thank you very much.
Right. I think we'll give that question to Roger Wheeler, at least in the first instance. What I won't do is get every member of the panel to comment, although at the very end, if there's anything hanging that you want to comment on the panel, please pick it up. But otherwise, we'll never get through everybody.
I'm sorry that my remarks about dealing with politicians to explain to them the nature of the army has been taken by you in the way that you have taken it. We have sitting down there an ex-Secretary of State for Defence, for whom I worked as the assistant head soldier. And I think, Malcolm, it would be fair to say that your relationship with the Chiefs of Staff was a pretty close one. At the time, we were dealing with the situation in Northern Ireland, and I think probably Bosnia as well, but the relationship within the British Ministry of Defence between the chiefs of all the services and the Chief of Defence Staff and our political masters, in my experience, has been close enough for us to be able to discuss what politically they wish to achieve and how we militarily can achieve it for them. So that's the way that I would describe it in our particular system. Perhaps another way of putting it is that a great friend of mine, whose name I shall not mention, had never been in the Ministry of Defence, came in as a two-star chap, and I said, you have to understand that this is a Ministry of State. It is not a military headquarters. It works on consensus between the politicians, the three services, and the civil servants who help us. And in my experience, that's how it worked. Is that fair, Malcolm?
Can I add a joke there?
You can add a joke, and I can see Chris wants to come in, so I think we're going to have to allow every panel to come in on this.
It was just from what Roger was saying there, that Dennis Healey, of course, Defence Secretary, in the 60s, said that he had never learned anything about politics until he met the Chiefs of Staff.
Chris, you wanted to come in?
I'm going to say that Margaret Thatcher had it absolutely right. When we went down the Falklands, we had the clearest direction on what was to be achieved, and we were given the choice about the military means which we were to employ. And I remember only one occasion where there was a certain amount of pushing, and that is when we were off South Georgia and we had an enemy submarine nearby, and the Prime Minister rang up, and we were quite busy, so an 18-year-old radio operator answered the satellite phone, and he said a number of times, "Who is it again?" And it's the Prime Minister. "Oh, right. Can I speak to the captain?" "No, ma'am. He's very busy at the moment." "You can't say no to the Prime Minister, young man." "Ma'am, he really is busy." "What was your name again?" And when the young man finally said, "We're sinking a submarine at the moment, Prime Minister," there was this shriek at the end. "He's doing what? Who told him to do that?" In fact, we had the rules of engagement. But that's another anecdote on that one. But the fact of life is that my worry is that, and Nick Horton can best answer this, my worry is that it's difficult to speak truth to power in anything less than total war by the military chiefs. Roger says, you need to have compromise. My studies into the Second World War is the last thing you want is compromise. You need to fight out the hardest solution to give to politicians. The fights between Marshall and King, the fights that Churchill had with his generals and admirals indicated that actually he wanted the answer. And I'm struggling to remember a quotation from Macaulay, who said that compromise is actually the enemy of logic. And in this case, in total war it is. In these much more fluid situations short of total war, then I agree that you have to get a compromise. There are too many moving parts. But I do worry that there are two things. There is the inability to talk truth to power, because I think military officers are inhibited in semi-peace, peacetime. And I also think that there isn't enough in the public discourse about military theory. You hear a lot from the City of London on financial theory, which ministers pay attention to. There isn't enough of the Jackie Fisher threatening in the Times to make cabinet officers' wives into widows and their homes into dunghills if he doesn't get 2 more battle cruisers.
Could I just say that
That's a joke, by the way.
In mentioning consensus, all I'm talking about is coming up with an agreed plan, otherwise you don't get the thing properly supported. But one thing the military have to do is to explain to the politicians what the risks are of what they're going to do. I'm not going to go into the Chilcot report, but if you read it, you'll find that didn't happen.
And Roger, I think it's important to say what you can't do. There's a real can-do attitude, which I've experienced throughout my career, and it's very difficult to say to politicians, you know what, we can't do that. I'll give an example. The SDSR of 1998 specifically excluded expeditions like that in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Can I just say, in relation to what General Wheeler said about the 1990s, one of the interesting contrasts in some respects in the early 2000s was the issue of whether or not, indeed, the Ministry of Defence was a command headquarters, was a military headquarters rather than Department of State, and that in itself created a tension. I'm tempted to ask CDS. Nick, the mic's right there, so perhaps you just...
I'd support what I'd support what Chris Parry said there pretty straightforwardly. I think if you are in a situation of non-discretionary war, when national survival is at stake, you do not mince your words in terms of sticking out for what the military recommendation is. But for things short of that, where it is discretionary, and to a certain extent, domestic politics has taken hold of part of the criteria for one's further involvement and its objectives, the nature of your advice has to be, it's not the nature of the advice is politicized, but the nature of the political objectives can alter. And certainly there was a point in the Iraq campaign in Basra and southern Iraq, and to an extent in the Afghan campaign, where from a political perspective, the criteria of success was the reduction in the number of troops deployed, as opposed to the conditionality we were leaving behind on the ground. Now that to me is an unhappy compromise, but one understood why the politicians were forced to make it. You can call that compromise, you can call it what you want, but I think there is, if anything, when it is short of non-discretionary war, of national survival or imperative threat, then I do think that some of these compromises are unfortunate from a purist military perspective.
Right, the question, yes, right here. Yes, I've got you behind, but immediately the chap in the check shirt, and then we'll go behind, and there's somebody right at the back, yeah.
Richard John, reading International Relations at this university. There was a wonderful comment made about learning languages, and I'd like to ask the former military members of the panel, why did we not teach our Marines and soldiers Arabic, Dari and Pashto when they were deploying into the field on foot patrols? How do you win hearts and minds if you cannot communicate with the population?
I'm tempted to say that's a rhetorical question, begging the answer. but if each of you wants to say something very quickly, then please do. But quickly.
I'm going to be quite upfront. This is a question of aptitude. You can't teach everybody languages that quickly, to tell you the truth. Jolly Jack, when he was on a run ashore, learns pretty easily how to say in 17 languages, "My friend will pay," as he departs from a bar. Okay, you can do that. And you can order beers and things like that, but you cannot actually do that sort of level of... it takes. I speak Russian and Spanish, but that's only by accident. There's no training program for me to do that. Okay, and it is not... With English being the global data language, a lot of English comes to you. This is what Marines have told me, rather than you have to go to them. The snag is then you only see a small section of the population. You're absolutely right. But there is an aptitude problem, there is a resource problem, of course, and of course, once you've learnt your Arabic, you're deployed to where next? Lithuania? You know, we can't multitask them.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything?
Well, I think where next is part of the problem. I think actually I would go back to being a continental army as far as the army is concerned in BAOR for 35 years, where we didn't stop to think about anything other than learning Russian or German. And subsequently, where you then go on expeditionary operations, we don't normally have the time, which is why, apart from the aptitude, you read about the effect on local interpreters who go with the patrols to produce the more complicated language and the troubles that they have had as a result of being associated with the Allies.
Hughes, one small point. One lesson from World War II is the one place you need languages is in your signals intelligence, your cyber now, and all the other things that get you to the battlefield. Once you're there, you cope with it as you can.
Okay. The pre-1914 army, if we're talking about lessons learned.
Lessons.
Lessons with the possibility of learning, but learned then, is you got extra pay for every language you learned.
Steve Cooper, no military experience whatsoever. I'll take the chairman's advice on whether he wants me to open the thing up a bit, but the discussion seems to have been about how we learn to do war better, and not about how we decide whether to go to war. Does the panel want to say anything about whether we can learn from history? There are times we really shouldn't, And how do we bring in this concept of a just war?
I'm tempted to say, though crucially important question, we have got a panel that is devoted to that topic, and we should probably address it then. Does that seem reasonable enough? I.e., the next panel. Can we defer it? But I entirely accept. I mean, can I ask each member of the panel, because I will come to them at the end, just to hold that thought, maybe, because I think otherwise we won't. Indeed, it's such a big question that we won't press on. Yeah, at the very back.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Folks. I have unfortunately, no connection with this university. Donald Trump says that he doesn't need to read extensively because he reaches the right decisions, quote, with very little knowledge. Others have said similar things, including Michael Gove's comments about having had enough of experts. Given the rise of populist politicians around the world, should those of us who think we should learn from scientists, from researchers and from historians and adapt accordingly be worried at all, or should we just invest in bunkers?
I'm going to ask Andrew to address that, as it had Trump in the question.
Right. So to explain Donald Trump, that is an ambush question. That's an impossible thing to do. Explaining Trumpism is difficult as well. I mean, Trump has scrambled the tenets and the normal doctrines of American foreign policy in really, really interesting, really fascinating ways, perhaps in dangerous ways. During the primary campaign for the Republican nomination, he was extremely critical of George W. Bush. He was extremely critical of a lot of the accepted wisdom that Republican presidents, as well as Democratic presidents and secretaries of state and so on and so forth, had adhered to. He was very critical of something that was up until that point canonical. It had a bipartisan canonical status, and that was George W. Bush's record in counterterrorism, anti-terrorism, that he'd made the world, or at least the United States, safe after 9/11, and Trump was very critical on those grounds. And what Trump is sort of emerging out of and feeding off of is this general discontent among Americans with bearing this burden of an international order, of paying a lot of the prices, of sending its soldiers around the world, basically to uphold an order that Americans now no longer feel, or a lot of Americans no longer feel, that they have a stake in, or that's really serving their interests. And if it is serving their interests, it becomes increasingly abstract, except for what's been referred to as sort of non-discretionary or existential questions about defending the homeland. And it's very interesting, I think, that this phrase, the homeland, didn't exist before 9/11, that it was national security, then it's homeland security, and you think, well, what's the difference between defending the nation and defending the homeland? Homeland was about defending actual physical territory, something that was very old, but then had been forgotten for a long time in American discourse. And so Trump, on either realist grounds or nationalist grounds or whatever you call them, has really changed the fundamentals, at least rhetorically, of American foreign policy and how the United States is going to be dealing with the world militarily, diplomatically, economically, strategically. Now, whether he actually brings about those changes and enacts those changes is an open question, but I think that he probably will. And then what will that do to the world order? What will that do to American relations with China and Russia? What will that do with Russia's and China's relations with their regions, their strategic regions? And what are the knock-on effects going to be? So we really are, I guess the point I'm trying to make is we really are at a moment, at a threshold moment that we haven't seen for 70, 75 years, where the whole very basis of a liberal international world order could be a thing of the past and could change in any number of ways.
Do you want to make a comment about experts?
Right, you mean about the question?
Yes. Well, Trump was a question too.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I thought I'd nicely dodge that. No, I mean, I get in. I've had. I mean, it's an enormously difficult thing because right now this populist fervor that is very strong in the United States. It is to a lesser extent here. People think that Trumpism and Brexit are the same thing. I think are missing key differences between the two. And I don't think Brexit is necessarily entirely a populist phenomenon, which I think Trumpism almost, I mean, it is. It's entirely populist. So there are commonalities, but I don't think that they're the same thing. And so what's the role of experts going forward, especially in a place like the United States? What's the role of expertise? A lot of that will depend on how successful Donald Trump is. And Trump could revive the expert. It could revive the faith in, if there ever was one, in academic expertise or in other forms of expertise, if his policies go disastrously wrong. But if they don't, then people like us could be in for a lot of trouble.
Right. I don't. There's a question right here.
My question.
Can you wait for the mic?
Sorry. My question is basically based on my experience at secondary school, which started 8 days after Neville Chamberlain declared war. And it finished, or was finishing, when the bombs were dropped on Japan. And one lesson from this I've learned is that, with due respect to historians, history is just one bloody war after another. And also that when you vote, you are voting at any general election, you're voting for a party and possibly a prime minister, and he or she may lead the country at war. Have we forgotten this?
I'm going to throw that one at you, Jill.
Well, you won't be surprised that I don't really go along with history being one bloody war after another. But I do think that an important thing that history can do now is to try and enlighten whoever needs to stress the fact that you need to look always at things from the inside out. It's no good looking back and saying, we now know that this turned out very badly, because actually that's not taking any account of the sort of pressures that people were under at the time. And in order to make the best use of previous events in future events, you've got to try and understand why things happened as they did, not whether they turned out well or badly. For example, some of the things we've been hearing about what the military need to do when they talk to politicians, absolutely right. But every politician, if you see a group of ministers sitting around the cabinet table, each one of them is subject to very particular pressures in relation to their departmental responsibility, in relation to the economic situation, in relation to the multilateral or bilateral agreements the country may be. I mean, there are any number of things. And in a particular situation of crisis where there's a possible military outcome, those things don't go away. Even if you're having a cabinet meeting that's entirely about whether to go to war, those things are still there. And I think the value that history can have is to lay it out like that, lay out what the factors were. I was very encouraged the other day. We had an event in the Foreign Office to mark the 60th anniversary of the Suez Crisis, in fact. And we had a panel where everybody was talking about the details of that particular year. Now, most of the audience were very young officers in the Foreign Office who knew very little about Suez, actually, other than that it was supposed to be the national humiliation for which nobody can ever quite get over. But once you start looking at the actual details and the inside and what the pressures were and who was doing what when, several people came afterwards, and one of them said, I'm doing horizon scanning for the Department for International Trade. And I found that really helpful in looking forward at what we're trying to do. And I thought, good. So it is difficult. I entirely accept that the way life turns out can make people say history is no bloody good at all. It's no use to us. Nobody ever learns anything. They just keep repeating the same mistakes again. But historians have a responsibility to try and explain what happened at each time in order to try and inform the future, and that's all we can do.
That, in a way, going back to the question which I ducked from the gentleman in the middle over there, actually goes a long way to addressing some of those questions, that when you confront issues of whether to go to war or not, you are in government, unless it is possibly major war with very little options to whether you fight or not, you are confronting many different competing variables if you're in government, which makes it extraordinarily hard to come to a coherent decision. And we probably need to be aware of that. I'm tempted to turn to Andrew partly to pick up the theme and come back to your question precisely because it seems to me Gill has come round to it.
Yeah, I mean, so policymakers, people might rebut me, policymakers here might disagree, but from archival evidence, it's clear that policymakers, at least in the United States, reason by analogy constantly. And whenever you go through oral histories or recordings or memos or whatever, during the run-up to a war, during the decision-making on a war, there's constant reference to history. There's constant reasoning by analogy. And it's fascinating to see how people use history. And there's no definitive answer. We can be careful. We can be as deeply grounded in context as possible. Any one of us, either now or in the past. But it's impossible to be definitive about history. That's one of the things about history. There are very few things, just basic facts that we can be definitive about, but when we think about why things happen the way they do, there are any number of competing interpretations. And so we have to be very careful when we use history to argue about the justifications or reasons for war. I remember after 9/11 teaching in the United States at a university where there were lots of experts on American foreign policy, on grand strategy, on the Middle East. And there were any number of teach-ins and workshops and seminars on 9/11 and then on Afghanistan when it was clear the United States was going to go to war in Afghanistan. And there were a number of world-leading experts, people whose names would be instantly recognizable if I mentioned them here, who said this cannot be done. The United States can't go into Afghanistan and win this war. Just ask the British, just ask the Russians. This can't be done in the way that we want to do it. And so the Bush administration is foolish even to try. Well, the Bush administration was foolish. They tried it. They succeeded. And then during the run-up to the Iraq War, when a lot of the same people said, it can't be done, this is too difficult, so on and so forth, we're not going to be able to pacify and change this country, a lot of people in the Bush administration could say, well, you told us that before, and this is how good your reasoning by analogy and your reasoning through historical precedent actually is. So we have to be very careful in making definitive claims about the use of history and looking to the past to guide us on the present and indeed the future.
Can I just add to that over my career in government, as a historian in government, I cannot count the times that I have written in advice that may go to ministers or senior officials. This is not Munich. This is not Suez. It is in an entirely different context.
The key thing is pick your experts. And the one war that I would draw your attention to is, I used to say to students, you've read the Iliad, haven't you? Now I say, you've seen the film Troy, haven't you? If you remember, the expert who was consulted there was Priam's daughter, Cassandra. And she said, there's Greeks inside that horse. And they all went, no, there isn't. Okay, drag the horse in.
Roger, would you like a final remark?
No, well, I think only that, apropos experts, I was involved in decision-making about going into Kosovo, and the Secretary of State, to go back to that gentleman there, having attended Cabinet, came across and saw Charles Guthrie, who was the Chief of Defence Staff, and said, so when can we go? And General Charles said, I have no idea. Send for Wheeler. He runs the army. And I said, I don't have any idea either, because I must ask the people who are experts as A, how ready are we? B, have we got the right kit? C, how long is it going to take the Navy and the Air Force to get us there? And those sorts of things. That is the level of expertise that is needed before decisions are made to go to war, of whatever sort of war it is.
Don't give it to MPs.
Well, let me, as a historian, end this session by referring to one of the truly great historians, Marc Bloch, French economic historian, analyst, who served in both World Wars and was executed in 1944 by the Germans, having been captured fighting for the resistance. And he wrote an account of 1940 in order to try to explain why an army that had been successful in the First World War had not been so successful in the Second. And so one of the problems at the École de Guerre, and it comes exactly back to the point about analogy, was that there was this determination to attend to the campaigns of Napoleon, understanding war in terms of continuity. But the challenge for the historian is to integrate continuity with change. And the interest, of course, for many historians is in dramatic change, the French Revolution, the end of the Cold War, whatever it might be, the turning points, some of which we've heard about this afternoon. And judging that balance between those two relationships does seem to be central to exactly this. And the problem with analogy is it does take us back to the past in a very literal-minded way, which is almost universally, as we've essentially repeated, I think, and Gill made very clear, has been unhelpful. Please join me in thanking our panelists very much indeed, all of them, and then go and have your tea.